We interrupt with breaking news. The businessman has passed away. He's dead? Did you hear that? Yes, he's gone. This changes everything. He is dead. We can inherit all his properties.
The first time Chief Emeka Obi died, nobody believed it. The second time he made sure they did. This is the story of a man who built an empire in silence, lost faith in the people around him, and faked his own death to find out who among the vultures and the mourners actually loved him. This is the story of Port Harcourt, of old money and new greed, of family that bites and strangers that heal. And at the center of it all, a young woman named Adaeze who didn't even know she was being watched. Let us start from the beginning. Chief Emeka Obi was 71 years old and worth more money than most people in River State would see in 3 lifetimes. He had started with nothing the way most people in his generation started. Born in 1952 in a small compound in Rumuola, the third son of a palm wine tapper and a petty trader, Emeka grew up understanding hunger not as a concept but as a physical presence, something that sat beside him at the dinner table and slept next to him on the mat. His father was a kind man but a poor one. His mother was strong but tired. There were 6 children and never enough food for all of them. What Emeka had from the very beginning was his mind. Sharp, calculating, patient. While other boys played in the mud after school, Emeka read. He read anything he could find. Newspapers left behind at the motor park. Old exercise books with half-finished lessons. A tattered Bible that his mother kept on the windowsill. He read it all. His primary school teacher, a tall Igbo man named Mr. Chukwemeka, once told him something he never forgot. Emeka, your head is not like other heads. It does not just store information. It connects things. That is a rare gift. Use it. Emeka used it. He finished secondary school with distinction. He gained admission to study accounting at the University of Port Harcourt. He worked part-time to pay his fees, sweeping offices, running errands for traders at Waterlines Market, helping a Lebanese man who sold building materials keep his records. That Lebanese man, Mr. Fairs, taught him something school never did. He taught him that wealth was not about working hard. It was about making money work for you. Watch the goods, not the labor, Mr. Fairs told him one evening as they closed the shop. A man who only sells his time will always be poor. But a man who makes his money move will always be rich. After university, Emeka did not look for a job. Everyone around him was looking for jobs, sending applications, attending interviews, coming home with nothing. Emeka watched and thought and finally decided he would not join that line. He took his small savings, borrowed a little from an old classmate and started buying and reselling building materials. Slowly at first, then faster, then explosively. By the time he was 35 he had a warehouse. By 40 he had 3. By 50 he had expanded into real estate, oil servicing and logistics. By 60 he was a billionaire. A quiet billionaire. The kind that does not appear on covers of magazines unless they choose to. Chief Emeka Obi chose not to. He drove a modest car. He lived in a large but not ostentatious compound in Old Jere. He wore simple native attire. He went to church on Sundays at the same Anglican church in Rumuola where his mother had prayed for 40 years. He gave to the community quietly without cameras. He paid school fees for children in his street. He funded a borehole project in his village. He sponsored young businesspeople through a small foundation he ran without a publicist or a social media account. People who knew him said he was a man of few words and deep thought. People who did not know him sometimes mistook him for a retired civil servant. He had been married once. His wife, Ngozi, died in 2005 from a brief illness that moved faster than the doctors expected. They had no children. That was the one wound in Emeka's life that never fully closed. They had tried for years. The hospitals, the prayers, the village herbs, the pilgrimages. Nothing came. And when Ngozi finally left, she took with her the warmth that had lived in that big compound. Emeka continued. That was what he knew how to do. Continue. After Ngozi died, the relatives appeared. This was not unusual in Nigeria. When a wealthy man has no children and loses his wife, the relatives come like rain during Harmattan. Sudden, unexpected, and not entirely welcome. They came with their condolences and their calculations. His younger brother, Chidi, who had spent most of his life living off small help from Emeka, suddenly became very present. His nephews, 3 young men he had sponsored through school, started calling regularly. His late wife's sisters began visiting the compound. His cousin Ifeoma, a loud and aggressive woman from Owerri, began referring to herself as the family spokesperson. Emeka noticed all of this. He said nothing. He watched. Over the next decade, the relatives organized themselves into something that looked like care but smelled like strategy. They visited. They cooked for him. They sat with him at night. They drove him to the hospital when his blood pressure spiked. They argued about who was more dedicated, who had sacrificed more, who deserved his trust. Behind his back, they argued about the will. In front of him, they smiled. Emeka was not fooled. He had spent 50 years reading people the way he read ledgers. He knew when numbers were off. He knew when people were performing. But he was old now and lonely, and sometimes performance is better than emptiness. There was one person who did not perform. Her name was Adaeze Nwosu. She was 26 years old, a graduate of the University of Port Harcourt, where she had studied social work. She was from Okrika, the daughter of a fisherman who had died when she was 12 and a seamstress mother who had raised 4 children on a machine and determination. Adaeze was not family. She was not a business associate. She had come into Emeka's life through an accident, literally. In 2019, Emeka had collapsed briefly in the compound. His blood pressure had crashed. His gateman panicked. It was Adaeze, who happened to be walking past on her way to visit a neighbor down the street, who heard the commotion and came inside. She had done a first aid course as part of her social work training. She stabilized him, called an ambulance, rode with him to the hospital, and stayed until his relatives arrived 3 hours later. She did not ask for anything. She did not give her number to anyone. She just left. Emeka found her through his gateman, who remembered her face. He tracked her down, thanked her, and asked if she needed anything. She said no. He asked if she would consider working for him as a personal assistant and general household coordinator. She thought about it for 2 weeks, then agreed. For 3 years, Adaeze worked in that compound. She managed his schedule, organized his medications, coordinated with his staff, and sat with him on evenings when the loneliness was loudest. She made him tea. She read newspapers aloud to him when his eyes were tired. She argued with him about politics and laughed at his old jokes. She called him Chief respectfully in front of others and Baba grudgingly when they were alone because he had insisted on it, saying Chief makes me feel like a tombstone. She was not performing. She genuinely liked the old man. The relatives did not like Adaeze. They found her presence suspicious. Who was this girl with no blood connection living so close to a billionaire's ear? What was she after? Ifeoma called her a gold digger in Igbo when she thought Adaeze could not hear. Chidi suggested to Emeka that having a young woman so involved in his affairs was not appropriate. The nephews were polite to her face and cold behind her back. Even Ngozi's sisters, who had no real claim to anything, made it clear that they considered Adaeze an outsider. Adaeze heard all of it. She said nothing. He kept doing her job. Then in early 2023, Emeka got sick. Properly sick this time. His heart was struggling. His doctors told him he needed surgery. The surgery was risky at his age. He survived it, but the recovery was long and difficult. During those months, the relatives visited more than ever. They brought food and prayers and long speeches about how much they loved him. They also, Emeka noticed, began making inquiries. Which lawyer held his will? Had he considered adding names to his property documents? Was there a trust? Where were the company shares registered? Emeka lay in his hospital bed and watched. And something broke in him. Not his body. His body was recovering. Something else. Something harder to name. He had spent his whole life building something real. And the people around him were circling it like it was already dead. Like he was already dead. That was when the idea came to him. He discussed it first with his lawyer, a sharp woman named Barrister Titi Okon, who had worked with him for 15 years and who he trusted completely. Then he discussed it with Adaeze's mother, which surprised everyone including Adaeze, though Adaeze did not know about the discussion until much later. And finally he put the plan in motion. Chief Emeka Obi would fake his death. Not permanently. Not cruelly. Just long enough to see the truth. Long enough to watch what happened when the money was suddenly on the table and nobody was looking. In October 2023, news spread through Port Harcourt that Chief Emeka Obi had passed away in his sleep at his residence in Old Jire. He was 72. The announcement came through a statement released by Barrister Titi Okon on behalf of the family. The burial was scheduled for 3 weeks later, to allow for arrangements and for family to travel from different states. The city responded the way cities respond to the death of quiet billionaires. Shock first, then grief, then slowly, quietly, calculation. Emeka himself was not dead. He was in a small house in Rumuola, the same neighborhood where he grew up, renting a room under a false name, an old man with glasses and a cap who the landlady thought was a retired teacher from Anambra. He had a phone. He had Barrister TT as his eyes and ears. And he had a small camera system that his tech consultant had installed in the compound before the announcement. He watched everything from that small room. What he saw broke his heart. The relatives arrived within 48 hours. Not slowly, not respectfully, but with the urgency of people who have been waiting for something for years. Chidi arrived first, driving a car Emeka had never seen before, with a woman Emeka did not recognize who appeared to be a lawyer. They set themselves up in the main parlor and began making calls. Who was named in the will? Had the safe in the study been opened? What about the foreign accounts? Ifeoma arrived the next day with 3 of her children. She immediately took over the kitchen and began organizing things as though the compound already belonged to her. She told Emeka's gateman Malam Haruna, who had worked in that compound for 17 years, that his services would no longer be needed after the burial. She told the housekeeper the same thing. She moved into the master bedroom, Emeka's bedroom, and rearranged the furniture. The nephews Emmanuel, Tibena, and Keen arrived on day 3. They went straight to the study and began cataloging items. The bookshelves, the electronics, the framed certificates on the walls, even the old grandfather clock that had stood in that room since Ngozi was alive. They spoke loudly and without shame about what each of them deserved, based on what they had sacrificed, based on what they were owed. Owed. That word made Emeka grip his phone in that small room in Rumuola until his knuckles hurt. On the 4th day, one of the nephews, Tibena, was caught by Malam Haruna attempting to remove a painting from the wall of the dining room. It was not an expensive painting, just a watercolor of the Niger Delta that Emeka had bought from a young artist in Bonny for 2,000 naira in 1998. He had always liked it. It reminded him of simpler days. Tibena told Haruna that he was just moving it for safekeeping. Haruna, who was loyal and who had not yet been told his services were terminated, said he would need written authorization. Tibena told him he was a gateman and should mind his business. Emeka watched this on camera and felt something move in his chest that was not his heart. Meanwhile, Ngozi's sisters had arrived from Owerri. They brought a petition, an actual written document, claiming that as the relatives of the deceased wife, they had a cultural and moral right to a share of the estate. They presented it to Barrister TT at a meeting held at the compound on day 5. TT received it without expression and told them she would communicate with the estate. The noise was constant. The arguing was constant. Nobody was grieving. Nobody was sitting quietly and remembering the man. Nobody was telling stories about who he was or what he had meant to them. They were dividing a man who was not yet in the ground. Then there was Adaeze. When the announcement came, Adaeze had been visiting her mother in Okrika for the weekend. She received a call from Malam Haruna. Chief Don die, he said simply. And Haruna, who was not a man who cried, was crying. Adaeze sat on the floor of her mother's small sitting room and did not move for a long time. When she finally arrived at the compound 2 days later, she was not thinking about money. She was not thinking about assets or inheritance or what she deserved. She was thinking about an old man who had been kind to her when kindness cost him nothing and continued to be kind when it would have been easier to be cold. She was thinking about the evenings on the veranda when he talked about Ngozi. She was thinking about the way he always kept a small tin of ground nuts on the side table and offered them to whoever sat with him without ever finishing them himself. She was thinking about how he had once quietly paid for her younger sister's hospital bill without telling anyone, and had been embarrassed when Adaeze found out. She arrived at the compound and found it full of people she barely knew making noise she did not understand. Ifeoma looked at her from across the compound with the eyes of a woman who had already won something. One of the nephews asked her, loudly enough for others to hear, whether she had come to collect her things. Adaeze said nothing. She went to the kitchen because it was the only room that felt like it still remembered the man who used to live there. She sat on the small stool near the window where Chief Emeka used to sit every morning while she made his tea. She put her head in her hands. And she cried. Not loudly. Not for performance. Just quietly, privately, the way people cry when they are not trying to convince anyone of anything. Malam Haruna found her there. He sat on the floor beside her without saying anything. After a while he said, "You really loved him." It was not a question. It was a statement of recognition from one grieving person to another. Yes, Adaeze said quietly. He was a good man. Outside, the negotiations continued. Barrister TT had called a formal meeting for day 7 to discuss the will. The compound filled up with tension. Ifeoma had already told 3 different people that she expected to be named primary beneficiary. Chidi had a lawyer review the structure of Emeka's companies. The nephews were arguing among themselves about whether to contest the will if it did not go their way. Ngozi's sisters were consulting a traditional ruler about cultural rights. It was chaos. It was ugly. And it was all on camera. On day 6, something small happened that Emeka did not expect. Adaeze, who had stayed in the compound because she felt someone needed to maintain some dignity in the house, was cleaning the study. She was not looking for anything. She was just cleaning because that was what she knew how to do when she did not know what else to do. And as she dusted the shelves, she found a small framed photograph hidden behind a row of books. It was a photograph of a very young Emeka and a woman who must have been his mother, both of them squinting into the sun outside a mud compound, both of them smiling the way people smile when they do not have much but they have each other. Adaeze sat with that photograph for a long time. Then she took it to her room for safekeeping because she had noticed that things were disappearing from the study. Emeka saw this on camera. He had to stop watching and sit still for a while. The next morning, Adaeze did something else. She went to the Anglican church in Rumuola where Chief Emeka had worshipped for decades. She spoke to the pastor and asked if the church could hold a small prayer service in his memory, something quiet, something that honored the man rather than the money. The pastor agreed. Adaeze organized it herself. She printed simple programs, just his name, his dates, a scripture he had loved, Romans 8 verse 28. She called a few of his genuine friends, older businesspeople and church members who remembered him from before the money. She bought flowers with her own salary. She did not tell the relatives. She knew they would turn it into a performance. 11 people attended that small service. Emeka, watching from his room through the eyes of the pastor, who was the only other person outside of Barrister TT who knew the truth, was one of them in spirit. 11 people who actually mourned the man. Not the billionaire. Not the properties. The man. On day 7, Barrister TT held the meeting at the compound. The parlor was full. Chidi and his mystery lawyer sat on one side. Ifeoma and her children sat on another. The nephews were together near the window. Ngozi's sisters sat near the door. Adaeze sat alone at the back, near the wall, a little apart from everything, the way she had always been a little apart from the family noise. Barrister TT opened the meeting by reading a prepared statement. She said that Chief Emeka Obi had left a will, duly notarized and registered, and that the will's contents would be read and executed as stipulated. She said that as executor of the estate, her firm would ensure that all legal processes were followed correctly. She said that any claims not recognized in the will would need to follow due legal process through the courts. Then she said something that made the room very quiet. She said that Chief Emeka Obi had one final request before the will was executed. She placed a sealed envelope on the table. She said the envelope was to be opened only when the room was ready to hear it. Ifeoma said, "Open it now." Chidi said, "Yes, let's hear it." The nephews nodded. Ngozi's sisters leaned forward. Everyone was present. Everyone was ready. Everyone was hungry. Barrister TT opened the envelope. She unfolded a single sheet of paper. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the room. Then she read it. "To my family and those who came to collect," she read, "I want you to know that I heard every conversation. I saw every calculation. I watched from closer than you think. A man who has lived long enough learns one thing that no money can teach. He learns who people are when they believe nobody is watching. I have watched. I am sorry for what I have seen. I hope you are not sorry for what you showed me." The room was confused. TT continued reading. "I am not dead." Silence. Complete silence. Then noise. Total noise. The door opened. And Chief Emeka Obi walked into his own parlor. He looked exactly as he always had. Modest. Quiet. A small man in a simple agbada, walking slowly with his cane, his eyes moving around the room with the calm of someone who has been watching for a long time. He sat in the armchair at the head of the room, the one that had always been his, and looked at his family. The reactions were different. Ifeoma stood up and then sat down and then stood up again. Chidi turned a color that was difficult to name. The nephews looked at each other as though searching for a script. Ngozi's sisters held each other. Several people were talking at once and none of it was making sense. At the back of the room, Adaeze sat completely still. Her hand was over her mouth. Her eyes were full of tears. But she was not standing up. She was not speaking. She was just looking at the old man in the armchair, this man she thought she had lost, and on her face was nothing but relief. Pure, uncomplicated, selfish relief that had nothing to do with money. The relief of someone who is glad another person is alive. Emeka saw this. He saw all of it. He let the noise settle. He waited. He was patient. He had always been patient. Eventually the room quieted, the way rooms quiet when the person with the most power in them stops performing. He spoke. He said he was sorry for causing pain to anyone who had genuinely grieved. He said that what he had done was difficult and that it had cost him peace for the weeks he had spent in that small room in Rumuola. But he said he had needed the truth more than he had needed comfort. He said a man who is about to distribute everything he spent a lifetime building has the right to know where it will land. He said he had watched and he had learned. Then he said this. I have watched some of you mourn my properties. I have watched some of you mourn your expectations. I have watched some of you mourn your calculations. And I have watched one person mourn me. He looked at Adaeze. Adaeze looked back. She was still crying quietly. She did not seem to understand what was happening. Emeka asked her to come forward. She shook her head. She said, Baba, please. He said, come. She came slowly, passing between relatives who looked at her with expressions that had shifted from contempt to something more complicated. She stood before him. He said, you organized a church service for me. 11 people came. You were one of them. You paid for it yourself. You protected my mother's photograph when others were taking things that didn't belong to them. You stayed in this house not because you were waiting for something but because you couldn't bear to leave it empty. Tell me I'm wrong. Adaeze shook her head. She couldn't speak. He said, you never asked me for anything. In 3 years. Not once. She said, you gave me enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, I did. And now I will give you more. The room erupted again. Ifeoma's voice rose above everything else. She said this was an abomination. She said Adaeze had clearly manipulated an old man. She said blood is blood and no stranger girl should benefit from what a family built. Chidi said the will could be contested. The nephews spoke to each other rapidly. The noise was terrible. Emeka sat through it. Then he raised one hand. One hand. And the room went quiet. He said, I built this. Not us. Not family. Not blood. I, Emeka Obi, son of a palm wine tapper. I built this from nothing and I will decide where it lands. If any of you disagree, Barrister Titi's office is open on Monday. More silence. He looked at Chidi. He said, I paid your rent for 11 years, your children's school fees for 8 years, your wife's medical bills twice. I did not do it because you were blood. I did it because you needed it and I could help. That was enough reason. It was always enough reason. I am sorry that you forgot that lesson somewhere. He looked at the nephews. He said, I sponsored all 3 of you through university. 2 of you now have good jobs. 1 of you is running a business I helped capitalize. I am proud of that. But I watched you in that study these past days and I was ashamed of what you have become. Not because of greed. Greed is human. But because you forgot that the man who helped you was a man, not a treasury. He looked at Ifeoma. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, you slept in my wife's bed. I think you knew what you were doing. He looked away from her and did not look back. He turned to Adaeze's mother who was sitting in the corner. Nobody had noticed her arrive. She had been called by Barrister Titi early that morning and had sat quietly throughout everything, a small woman in a George wrapper and a head tie, watching with the eyes of a woman who had seen many things and was not surprised by this one. Emeka said, you raised this girl. I want to thank you. You gave her something that all my money cannot buy and cannot duplicate. You gave her character. Adaeze's mother bowed her head. She said nothing. But her shoulders moved. Then Barrister Titi read the will. It was clear, detailed, and had been prepared carefully over many months. The company shares in Obi Logistics Limited were divided between a management trust, 2 long-standing employees who had been with him for over 20 years, and a charitable foundation in Ngozi's name. The real estate portfolio was split, with significant portions going to 2 community development projects he had been quietly funding for years. A portion of liquid assets was distributed among his relatives, including Chidi and the nephews and even Ngozi's sisters. Not nothing. Not crumbs. Real money. Enough to change lives if they were wise with it. But the compound in Old Jire, the one he had lived in for 30 years, the one where Ngozi had planted the garden that still bloomed every rainy season, the one where Adaeze had made his tea every morning, that compound, along with a trust that would generate income for its upkeep and for Adaeze's personal future, was left to Adaeze Nwosu. Formally, legally, completely. And one other thing. His mother's photograph, the one behind the books. He had written it into the will. He wanted it to go to Adaeze. He had known she would find it before anyone else would. He had known because he knew her. The room was difficult after the reading. Some people left without speaking. Ifeoma left loudly. Chidi left with his lawyer and a face that had shut itself like a window in the rain. The nephews were more complicated. Emmanuel, the eldest, came to Emeka before leaving and said, "Uncle, I know I behaved badly. I'm sorry." He did not look at Adaeze. But he said it. Emeka shook his hand. Tibena and Keen left without speaking. Ngozi's sisters left peacefully. They had received something real and perhaps they had seen enough to be humbled. When the room was finally quiet, when it was just Emeka and Adaeze and her mother and Barrister Titi and Malam Haruna who had refused to go home despite being told to, Emeka sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. It was the breath of a man who had been holding something for a very long time. Adaeze sat across from him. She was still clutching the small framed photograph of him and his mother. He said, "You kept it safe." She said, "Of course I did." He said, "Are you angry with me? For the deception?" He thought about this honestly. She said, "I was afraid. When I heard you were gone, I was afraid in a way I have not been since my father died. So yes, a small part of me is angry that you put me through that." He nodded. He said, "I understand." She said, "But I understand why you did it. This house was full of wolves, Baba. You needed to see them clearly." He said, "I saw them. I also saw you." She said, "I was just doing what was right." He said, "That is the rarest thing." They sat together for a while in the quiet of the compound. Outside, the city moved and hummed and did not know that anything remarkable had happened inside these walls. Malam Haruna made tea the same way Adaeze had always made it, because he had watched her so many times he had learned without being taught. He placed the small tin of ground nuts on the table between them. Neither of them touched the ground nuts. They just sat there, two people who had found in each other something that money does not manufacture and cannot replace. Adaeze's mother sat nearby and watched her daughter and said nothing, but on her face was an expression that mothers wear when the world has surprised them by being decent. In the weeks that followed, the story moved through Port Harcourt the way stories move in that city, fast and loud and then slow and quiet as people absorbed it. Some people said Emeka had been cruel to his family. Some said he had been brilliant. Some said the whole thing was a fraud. Some said it was the most honest thing a rich man had ever done. Bloggers wrote about it. Church members discussed it. Business circles dissected it. Emeka did not comment publicly. He never had. What he did instead was this. He called a meeting with Chidi, not a confrontation, a conversation. They sat together in a neutral location, a small restaurant in Rumuola, and they talked for 3 hours. Emeka did not pretend that what he saw in those cameras had not hurt him. He told Chidi the truth. He said he had helped him for years out of love and it had felt like something was being taken from him, not given. He said he was sorry if he had ever made Chidi feel that help was conditional, but he also needed Chidi to understand that dignity was part of the equation. Chidi cried. Real crying, not performance. He apologized for the lawyer, for the conversations, for the bedroom door he had tried to open that had Emeka's financial documents inside. It was not a perfect reconciliation, but it was real. And real was enough to work with. He did the same with the nephews individually. Emmanuel came back on his own without being called and sat with his uncle for a full afternoon. He said he had been reading the story of his life backwards and did not like what he saw. He wanted to start writing a different chapter. Emeka said that was possible. That it was always possible if you were honest about the previous chapters. Tibena and Keen did not come. Perhaps they would come later. Perhaps they would not. Emeka did not chase anyone. He had learned in 72 years that you cannot force people to see themselves clearly. You can only create the conditions and wait. For Adaeze, life changed in ways that took time to understand. She moved into the compound not immediately but gradually, as though giving the space time to adjust to her. She kept her work, taking on a coordination role with the Adaeze Obi Foundation, the charitable arm Emeka had established in his wife's name. He was good at it. She had always been good at connecting people with what they needed. She found that all those years of watching and listening in that compound had taught her things about wealth and community that no university program had prepared her for. Her mother moved into a better house, not the compound. She preferred her independence, but a solid concrete building in Okrika with running water and a proper kitchen. Adaeze paid for it herself from her salary. He called Emeka to tell him. "Is it good? Don't let me pay for it." She said she had no intention of letting him. He laughed. He did not laugh often. But when he did, it was a good sound. He was still alive 2 years after his stage death. Alive in the way that people who have settled accounts with themselves are alive. Clear-eyed, unhurried, without the particular anxiety of someone who is afraid that the story will end before they have said what they needed to say. He had said it. He had shown it. He had documented it in a will and a memory and a small framed photograph on the wall of the compound kitchen, rehung where it belonged. One evening, Adaeze found him on the veranda, looking at the compound garden that Adaeze had planted. The garden had grown a little wild in the years since her death, but it was still beautiful. Stubborn things tend to grow beautifully if you leave them alone long enough. He said without turning, "Do you know what I regret?" She sat beside him. She said, "Tell me." He said, "I regret that I spent so many years watching instead of trusting. I watched everyone so carefully that I forgot that watching is not the same as knowing. You cannot know a person from a camera. You can only know them by sitting with them in ordinary time." She said, "You sat with me." He said, "Yes. Eventually." She said, "That was enough." He offered her the tin of ground nuts. She took a small handful. He did not take any as always. She had learned not to comment on this. Some habits are not habits. They are rituals. And rituals belong to the person performing them, not the person observing. They sat in the garden for a long time. The city hummed around them. The generators ran and the children played and the traffic moved on Rumuola Road, and none of it touched the quiet of that veranda where an old man and a young woman sat in the particular piece of people who have nothing to prove to each other. This is the story of Chief Emeka Obi and Adaeze Nwosu. But as with all true stories, it is also your story. Because we have all sat in that parlor in one form or another. We have all at some point rushed to the table when we heard a bell ring. We have all calculated our worth in someone else's loss. Some of us have caught ourselves and turned back. Some of us have not yet had the occasion to be caught. And some of us, fewer than we would like to think, have been Adaeze. Have sat in the kitchen and cried not for what we were losing but for who. Have protected small photographs. Have organized small church services that only 11 people attend. Have sat on a veranda with no agenda except the company. The world will not always reward you for this. The world is busy with other math. But occasionally, once in a long while, a man fakes his own death and watches carefully and sees you clearly. And in seeing you, gives you everything. The secret to being found is simple. Be the same person whether or not you think someone is watching. Be the same person in the compound when the man is alive and in the compound when you believe he is gone. Be the same person when you have nothing to gain and when you have everything to gain. Because you never know. The old man in the small room in Rumuola might be watching. And the camera does not lie. Remember, when you mourn a man, not his money, you are showing the world who you truly are. The inheritance of character is greater than the inheritance of wealth. Build the first one faithfully and the second one may follow. But even if it does not, you will still have yourself. And a person with genuine character will always find a way to begin again.